As a person who had lived 2 lives, Wang Chong had seen far too many things in that apocalyptic period, and he had also known too many secrets. Wang Chong had once seen someone use the Xianxia, though it hadn't been this person standing before him now. The Xianxia's secret art could massively boost a martial artist's strength for a short period of time, also improving his defense and the toughness of his stellar energy. This was a method of overstimulating one's potential, but it was extremely effective on the battlefield. No one can kill my warriors without paying a price, and I demand that all of you die. That Tibetan commander's hair began to spread out around him as his energy rose from tier 4 or 5 of the profound martial realm to tier 8 or 9, surpassing Li Sai. Rumble. Space twisted as thunderclouds gathered in his hands. Before Wang Chong had any time to react, that godlike Tibetan commander in the air had sent a fist rumbling out. The sky dimmed as stellar energy crashed down like a wave toward Wang Chong's army. That wave had not yet landed, but the terrifying pressure that preceded it was like a knife. The well-trained horses could not hold back their plaintive whinnies as they felt the terror of death. The soldiers Wang Chong had recruited were experts from the great clans, but they were all only at tier 5 or 6 of the true martial realm. They were simply no match for this profound martial expert who was further boosted by the Xianxia's secret art. Although the 1,000 soldiers had all been equipped with meteoric metal and had essentially emerged unharmed from their previous charges, once this fist crashed down, the tail end of the army was bound to suffer grievous casualties. Li Sai! There was no time to think, so Wang Chong immediately sent out Li Sai. At this moment, the only person on Wang Chong's side who could deal with this attack was Li Sai. Li Sai was the future invincible great general and authority of the empire. So even if he couldn't deal with that unusually strong Tibetan commander, Wang Chong truly wouldn't be able to think of any other candidates. Without a single word, Li Sai's right hand grabbed the massive sword on his back. With a boom, he took off from the back of his horse like a hawk. "Take my attack!" That resounding and emotionless voice thundered through the heavens. Li Sai's body disappeared from the air as a massive halo of thorns began to spread out from it. In an instant, it had transformed into a majestic storm that engulfed him. Li Sai had acted without hesitation. Li Sai's voice was still ringing in the air, but that massive and resolved wood steel sword was already slashing down on that Tibetan commander like Pangu One, cleaving open the world. Boom! A gale swept through the land. Wang Chong couldn't see that battle, but he could feel the earthquaking booms coming from behind him. That sound was like 2 massive beasts from prehistory ramming into each other, creating massive gusts that stirred up sand and shrouded the earth. Wang Chong did not feel the need to watch. He had absolute confidence in Li Sai's strength, and the power of the invincible great general didn't rest on something as simple as cultivation. More important to him was dealing with the remaining 2,500 Tibetan cavalry. Arrow formation. His right hand raised, Wang Chong immediately gave his second order to form the formation. The small snakes suddenly gathered together into a massive python. He had moved from the heaven-earth net back to that most traditional of cavalry formations, the arrow formation. The warhorses once more rumbled, the 1,000 Great Tang cavalry leaving a long trail of dust as they charged straight for the echelon formation of the Tibetan cavalry. There was a saying in the art of war: the superior general breaks the enemy's schemes while the inferior general schemes against the enemy's soldiers. Attacking the mind is superior to attacking the city. Right now, Wang Chong had completely broken the morale of the Tibetan army. Boom! Horse met horse, scimitar met sword, and the clattering of metal and plaintive neighing of horses mixed together into a single din. Kill them all! The Tibetan cavalryman's eyes went red from bloodlust, completely infuriated by this scene. Everyone knew that the arrow formation used by the Great Tang and the echelon formation of Yusang were 2 of the most famous cavalry charging formations in the world. But not even the most formidable of Great Tang cavalry would dare to engage in a frontal charge against the Tibetans. Of all the cavalry strategies, the Tibetan echelon formation was undoubtedly the strongest. Others who attempted to imitate the Tibetans would still not be able to reach their level. Even Longshi's Big Dipper Great General, the bane of Yusang, Geshu Han, had never thought about using cavalry to charge against Tibetans. Instead, He had taken an original approach and developed extremely heavy and large shields to resist the Tibetan cavalry charge. If not even the mighty Big Dipper great general dared to do such a thing, what right did these people have to challenge them? Kill them all! The anger in the minds of the Tibetans instantly reached its boiling point. The people of the Great Tang, familiar with the tactics of Yusang, had thought of using a shield taller than a man to deal with the charge of highland steeds. Similarly, Yusang, after fighting with the Great Tang for hundreds of years, had a keen understanding of the arrow formation's weak points. Although this formation was hailed as the best in the world for piercing through an enemy army, its flaws were equally as obvious as its advantages. The arrow formation's strongest point was also its weakest point. As long as one could break the sharp tip of the arrow formation, the rest of the army would fall into chaos. The strongest was also the weakest. Without the arrowhead to guide it, the arrow formation would lose its sharpness and fall apart. Boom! The two armies clashed, horses neighing as the earth shook. Countless Tibetan cavalry focused all their power on the head of the arrow formation. Kill them! Slaughter the people in the front! Everyone, together! Hold them down and avenge our brothers! These rushed and urgent Tibetan cries filled the skies, but when everyone believed that they could thoroughly crush the 1,000-man army, the arrow formation led by Wang Chong remained invincible. It pierced through wave after wave of the Tibetan echelons, bravely pressing through all of them. To the disbelief of the Tibetans, no matter how much they charged and hacked, the arrowhead of Wang Chong's arrow formation remained like the hardiest of reefs. No, it could not be simply described as hardy. Whenever they struck an arrowhead, slowing its speed, the arrowhead would voluntarily sink back into the army. At the same time, another arrowhead would instantly form to continue the charge. No matter how many times they charged, Wang Chong's arrow formation remained. This is impossible. All the Tibetans were dumbfounded. No one had ever been able to block the Tibetan echelon formation, nor had any Great Tang arrow formation ever endured so many charges. War was not a game of house. On the intense battlefield, once the head of an arrow formation was broken, it would never be given the chance to reform. But no matter how madly they charged, the arrowhead of Wang Chong's arrow formation would always swiftly reform. The frenzied efforts of the Tibetans were futile against Wang Chong. Order after order was issued, but these orders did not come from Wang Chong. They came from the 5-man and 10-man commanders. Before the arrowhead of the arrow formation could be destroyed, a new one would be forming to take its place. Meanwhile, the cavalry that had been slowed from the impact with the Tibetan cavalry were quickly absorbed back into the main force. Cold swords flashed through the air and Tibetan after Tibetan fell to the ground without a groan, cut into pieces by the Wuxia steel swords. In the meantime, those Great Tang cavalry who had been slowed gradually began to regain speed, eventually adding on to the end of the arrow formation. Everything happened swiftly and automatically. Round after round, over and over, the arrow formation of 1,000 soldiers worked like a fine-tuned machine. Before this precision, even Yusang's world-famous echelon formation felt like a grasshopper trying to stop a carriage. Crash! With a bout of painful and fearful screams, the last few Tibetan cavalry of the echelon formation were knocked flying like stray kites into the air. Wang Chong's arrow formation burst out of the Tibetan army, having cleared the entirety of the echelon formation. By this time, the Tibetan army was in complete chaos. Now is the time. Kill! After piercing through the entire formation, Wang Chong led his army in a figure 8 so that they could turn around and attack the Tibetans again. Once more, like a sharp arrow, the army charged into the tail end of the Tibetan echelon formation, throwing it further into chaos. Excellent! Success! Seeing the Tibetans in chaos, their advance completely stymied, Old Eagle clenched his fists as he inwardly rejoiced. This entire battle had been carried out under Wang Chong's command, and even though he had been at his side this entire time, not even he knew what was going on. He had been on the sidelines observing when Wang Chong was training this army and knew everything about the arrow formation, but he could have never expected this formation to be so powerful. And this wasn't just about piercing through the army and inflicting casualties. Wang Chong had completely shattered the ability of the Tibetans to fight. The most powerful aspect of an army was its ability to fight as a cohesive whole, and the more people there were, the more powerful it was. But if every person fought individually, this advantage would utterly vanish. This was precisely what Wang Chong had managed to do. Although this wasn't the first time Old Eagle had seen Wang Chong at work, none of the previous times had ever been as stimulating or as impactful to Old Eagle. This was his first time directly observing Wang Chong's talent, that brilliant and terrifying talent to command that far surpassed his age. Young master, Old Eagle looked at Wang Chong, a deep respect in his eyes. He had originally followed Wang Chong out of gratitude, but now, even without this reason, even if someone wanted him to leave, he would never leave. Wang Chong had a deep potential, one that did not lie in something as simple as strength. Old Eagle felt that in another 10 years, if nothing unexpected happened, this empire would gain another influential great general on the level of Ge Han, Fuming Lingcha, Gao Xianji, and Zhang Shogui, perhaps one even more outstanding. In his heart, Old Eagle no longer considered Wang Chong a junior, but a leader that he was willing to follow for the rest of his life. Of course, no one knew of any of this except for Old Eagle himself. Congratulations to user for killing 617 Tibetan regular heavy cavalry. Congratulations to user for killing 619 Tibetan regular heavy cavalry. Congratulations to user for killing 632 Tibetan regular heavy cavalry. Message after message flew through his mind, but Wang Chong couldn't be bothered to pay attention to them. Each time his Wu's steel sword slashed, another Tibetan would fall. The massive drop in Wang Chong's strength made it very difficult for him to deal with one Tibetan cavalryman alone, but this wasn't a problem. A large number of experts had gathered around him, which he had requested from Li Sai. These experts had originally been elites of the Black Dragon bandits in the western regions. When Li Sai killed their boss, he also subdued these elites. Wang Chong had requested these Black Dragon bandits elites to protect himself. Every time Wang Chong struck out with his sword, he needed 3 or 4 others to strike with him, and with this rain of blows, plop, another Tibetan would drop to the ground. With each fallen Tibetan, another stream of refined energy would flow from the little Yin-Yang sword into Wang Chong's body. The energy in Wang Chong's body had dropped down to tier 1 of the true martial realm, but by now, nourished by the blood energy of the Tibetans, it was rapidly rising. Boom! Wang Chong heard an explosion in his body as he shook. Like a volcano, a stream of energy instantly allowed him to break into tier 2 of the true martial realm. Stellar energy continued to flow, and it was only a few seconds later that there was another boom. Wang Chong had broken through again into true martial tier 3, and he was still rising. So powerful! The enemies filling this crowded battlefield were the finest nutrients for the little Yin-Yang art, and the rapid growth of energy in his body was almost intoxicating. At this moment, Wang Chong was experiencing the ecstasy felt by members of those evil sections. This ecstasy was almost maddening. Many people would be willing to take desperate risks to maintain it, killing more and more people to feel that rush of strength, not hesitating to kill for the sake of killing. So powerful, so powerful. There was another boom as Wang Chong's strength rose to tier 4 of the true martial realm, only 1 tier off from his original cultivation level of true martial tier 5. Blood began to suffuse his eyes, and a ruthless aura began to pervade his heart. A powerful impulse began to dominate Wang Chong's mind. Kill everyone around him and make them his food. Right now, his target was no longer just the Tibetans. Wang Chong now had the intense desire to point his sword at the people on his own side. Unable to tell friend from foe, he suddenly heard a voice at his ear. The evil path is called the evil path not because of a love for murder, but because of its indiscriminate killing, slaughter that does not differentiate between friend and foe. This isn't a consequence of the technique, but because that ecstasy that comes from a rapid swelling of strength is capable of triggering a person's most primal desires. But in normal circumstances, it's not easy for practitioners of the evil path to reach that point. You must remember that once you begin to feel that intense desire and lose the ability to tell friend from foe, when you want to even attack people on your own side, your little Yin-Yang art has reached its peak and you're about to suffer a cultivation defect. His master, the demonic emperor old man, had once told him these words. In these circumstances, his master had told him that he needed to calm down, stop absorbing energy, and rest for 3 to 4 months. After that, he would need to rely on his luck and will to restrain that desire. However, the demonic emperor old man had also told him a little technique. Boom! Without a thought, Wang Chong caused the flow of energy in a line of acupoints consisting of the Xianxia, Fengxiang, Renkei, and 3 other acupoints to suddenly reverse. In an instant, Wang Chong's mind instantly grew sober, as if a jar of ice water had been dumped over his head. That haze that made it hard for him to differentiate friend from foe instantly weakened. When the little yin-yang art reached its peak, one would risk suffering a cultivation defect. In the past, the demonic emperor old man had not said anything, holding back this information so that he could test the character of his disciples. However, his master had not kept any secrets from Wang Chong. Swoosh! A cold light flashed through the sky, penetrating through blood and bones. In the next moment, Wang Chong's body began to rumble and burn. The stellar energy from a slain individual had instantly pushed Wang Chong through the threshold of true martial realm Tier 5. As that body thumped to the ground, Wang Chong realized that it was the figure of a Tibetan 100-man commander. But before Wang Chong could look anymore, the earth quaked and the ground swayed. A powerful energy swept across the battlefield, generating a powerful gale that caused the white-hoofed shadow to rear up and neigh. Everyone, hear my order. Kill that Tang general. A ruthless order in Tibetan came from that cloud of dust in front of Wang Chong. Many people couldn't understand those words, but Wang Chong could. It's that Tibetan commander. With this flash of thought, Wang Chong instantly remembered. At almost the same time, a destructive energy shot toward him. Apprehensive, Wang Chong shook his shoulders, and stellar energy began to gush out of his body, forming a barrier that protected him and the white-hoofed shadow. All true martial realm experts had the powerful ability to use stellar energy to protect their bodies, which served as an excellent method of self-defense. Bang! Wang Chong had barely brought up his barrier of stellar energy when that furious energy struck. His horse neighed and Wang Chong felt the energy and blood in his stomach rage. As man and horse were sent flying back, the dust in front of Wang Chong settled, allowing him to finally see what was going on. In the front ranks of the Tibetan army, Li Sai was wielding his sword with both hands, breathing heavily as he stood like a giant. Across from him was no Tibetan commander, but a bronze figure, more than 1 zhang tall and fully armored, with 6 arms and a vicious expression of rage upon its face. It was a Xianxia Vajra Guardian one. No matter who you are, I'll have you die today. That massive Xianxia Vajra Guardian's 6 arms were each wielding a bronze artifact, and its resounding voice was like pealing thunder. Boom! The black-skinned and furious Xianxia Vajra Guardian took a step forward with its right foot and immediately sent one of its Vajras swinging. There was a heaven-shaking boom as a flood of stellar energy swept across the world to smash Li Sai. This massive power was enough to pummel a hill into dust. Rumble! In the face of this heaven-shaking Vajra, Li Sai raised the massive wood steel sword over his back, stirring up roaring waves of energy. Bringing the sword over his head, he slammed it down. A blazing lightning bolt streaked out of the air. Dust plumed as these 2 profound martial realm experts clashed. When the dust settled and Wang Chong saw the result, his eyebrows flew up in disbelief. Yu Sang had many formidable martial arts, and though Wang Chong didn't know many of them, this black-skinned and furious-faced Xianxia Vajra Guardian was unquestionably one of them. But this was not the reason for Wang Chong's surprise. What shocked him was that Li Sai's sword, personally forged by Wang Chong and inscribed with many toughening and sharpening inscriptions, had actually been blocked by those golden gauntlets worn by that Xianxia Vajra Guardian. How could there be an armament like that? Wang Chong asked himself in consternation. A wood steel weapon could cleave through metal and cut through jade, and was so sharp that a falling hair would be severed on its unmoving blade. And this weapon was even more impressive in Li Sai's hands. As a future great general of the empire, Li Sai could display an unfathomable power with this weapon in hand. Back then, he had relied on his own power and this sword to exterminate the hundreds of Black Dragon bandits. Would steel weapons counted as one of the sharpest weapons in the world, a fact that could not be questioned. Wang Chong had never imagined that any other weapon or armament would be capable of blocking Li Sai's full-force blow. At this moment, Wang Chong heard a very soft but crisp sound. This sound was almost inaudible, but Wang Chong had managed to catch it. No, he didn't block it. His gauntlets are cracked. It was obvious that the material those gauntlets were made of was slightly inferior to wood steel. It's meteoric metal. With this flash of insight, Wang Chong immediately understood. A material that could still block wood steel but was slightly inferior could only be meteoric metal. The Tibetan plateau didn't have much iron ore, so most of their iron ore was imported from elsewhere. However, the Tibetan plateau did have one thing: meteoric metal. Over the ages, meteorites would often fall into the pastures of the Tibetan plateau. The Yusang Empire would often dispatch people to gather those fallen meteorites and forge weapons from them to equip their subordinates. What Wang Chong had not expected was that this Tibetan commander not only knew the Ksitigarbha's secret art, he also had a weapon forged from meteoric metal. Rumble. Dust roiled as that giant six-armed Ksitigarbha Vajra guardian wielded Vajra, spear, cudgel, and gauntlets against Li Sai, joining its attacks with the other Tibetan cavalry. The power of the Ksitigarbha Vajra guardian was already pressuring Li Sai, and now with the attacks from the others, Li Sai quickly descended into a bitter struggle. Old Eagle led some people in a charge to scatter them. Wang Chong unhesitantly ordered, his eyes glimmering with an icy light. This Tibetan commander was far too strong. Given the incredible power in each of his attacks, if Li Sai were not blocking them, Wang Chong's army would immediately suffer terrible casualties. When a person's strength reached a certain level, numbers and tactics became irrelevant. Wang Chong only had 1,000 people at his side, and he couldn't lose them here before the true war had even begun. Yes, young master. Old Eagle complied and began to holler orders, leading several hundred people charging over. Humph, you want to help him? You're seeking death. The Ksitigarbha Vajra guardian's voice thundered in their ears. Before the troops could react, a bronze spear flew through the air like a bolt of lightning. This single spear immediately struck a clan expert from his horse, smashing a giant hole in the ground. As the dust settled, it was possible to see from the deformation of the armor and the pooling blood that this expert was dead. Careful! Old Eagle paled and quickly pulled the reins on his horse. These were all experts recruited from the great clans, possessing extraordinary strength, and they also had meteoric metal armor. This armor had powerful defensive capabilities, as Old Eagle had personally experienced. Not even the Tibetan cavalry at full charge had been able to leave a mark on this armor, but this one spear from that Tibetan commander had slain one of these armored experts. This strength was simply absurd. Don't come over. I can still deal with it. Li Sai's anxious voice came from the distance. Wang Chong and the rest weren't in this fight, so they didn't know just how formidable this commander was. In terms of strength, he had already reached profound martial realm tier 9, and the secret incarnation techniques of the Great Snow Mountain Holy Land were not as simple as outsiders imagined. Li Sai currently had a very strong feeling that this Tibetan commander was no obscure soldier or mediocre commander. Old Eagle, go over and help Li Sai. The rest of you, use the mobile circle to eliminate the rest of the Tibetan soldiers. But young master, what of Li Sai? Old Eagle anxiously asked. If Li Sai couldn't block the commander's attacks, the rest of them would be fish in a barrel, waiting to be slaughtered. Old Eagle, listen to my orders, Wang Chong declared, his eyes icily gazing into the distance. You have Zhang Liang's plans, and I have my wall-scaling ladders one. Since you've ordered the majority of your forces to deal with Li Sai, don't blame me for gathering my troops to deal with the rest of the Tibetans. This is a competition of strength and will to see which one of us can kill their opponent faster and free up troops. Yes, Old Eagle hardened his heart and took off. At almost the same time, a thunderous voice tore through the sky. Dangba! Stop him! The Tibetan commander, transformed into the six-armed Ksitigarbha Vajra guardian, also issued his order. Yes, my lord. Immediately, the Tibetan deputy commander took off with a rumbling of stellar energy and began to engage in an intense struggle with Old Eagle. Meanwhile, as Wang Chong watched on the side, the 1,000 Great Tang cavalry swiftly began to take a formation that had never been seen before in all the history of the Great Tang. The mobile circle. This was a tactic that Wang Chong had developed in his last life, a formation that he had developed using his knowledge from the other world. It could only be used when one possessed the upper hand and was cleaning up the enemy, and allowed one to cut down the enemy as quickly as possible. Buzz. Extending their Wuxia steel swords out at an angle, the soldiers formed gears in groups of 60, the Wuxia steel swords forming the teeth of these gears. The 60 cavalry began to move in a circular motion, causing the massive gear to crazily cut into the enemy. Aya! One Tibetan cavalryman after another fell, their bodies cut to pieces by the spinning wheel of Wuxia steel swords and raining down to the ground. It took only a few moments for several hundred more Tibetan cavalry to fall, and their numbers continued to rapidly drop. Watching from a distance, Dangba and the Tibetan commander paled. Boom! There was a flash of light as a bronze spear shot forward, instantly traveling through space to reach Wang Chong. Careful! Everyone paled, but when the dust had settled, they saw that the spear was sticking out of the ground, the completely unharmed Wang Chong standing right next to it. Everyone was dumbfounded. This scoundrel! The Tibetan commander's eyes narrowed as a murderous intent surged in his heart. If one said that he still hadn't known who the leader of this Tang army was at the start, he was certain who it was now. Although he found it impossible to believe, there was no doubt that the true leader of this army was not this powerful Tang expert he was currently fighting against, but that apparently negligible Tang youth. Humph! Wang Chong only gave a cold laugh. He continued to stand at his spot while the experts from the Black Dragon bandits guarded his surroundings. This Tibetan was far too strong, such that no one was able to intervene in his fight with Li Sai, not even Old Eagle. However, even though he had used the Xianxia secret art to reach profound martial tier 9, he had still gravely underestimated him. Although his strength was currently far inferior, Wang Chong had still once been a Saint Martial Realm expert, much stronger than this Tibetan commander. His reincarnation had deprived him of that mighty strength, but he still had his experiences and insight. Moreover, Wang Chong had already seen that lethal spear at work, so he had naturally prepared to deal with it. Brat, you're dead for sure. That cold voice came from the distance as a monstrous killing intent locked onto Wang Chong. But Wang Chong remained unmoved. In this battle, if Li Sai couldn't deal with this man, no one else would be able to. Li Sai! Wang Chong suddenly opened his mouth. Xiaoyang, Taiyin. Wang Chong listed off 3 acupuncture points. In that instant, the battlefield fell silent. No one knew what Wang Chong was talking about, but Li Sai did understand Wang Chong's next set of words. A great army's swift retreat, 10 charges for 10 victories, sunder the mountains and rivers. Buzz! In a flash, Li Sai acted. Just when the Xianxia Vajra Guardian was thrusting at his Xiaoyang acupuncture point, he suddenly retreated, his heavy sword swiftly withdrawing and blocking all 6 of the Xianxia Vajra Guardian's arms and weapons at once. Boom! He stepped forward with his right foot just as the Vajra Guardian moved to once more attack his Xiaoyang acupuncture point. With grace and fluidity, he avoided the second blow, and then the third blow, after which he began the 10 charges for 10 victories. CRSH. Under Li Sai's furious assault, the 6-armed Xianxia Vajra Guardian suddenly showed an opening. Li Sai's Wuxia steel sword immediately plunged in, entering through the thigh of the Vajra Guardian. This move not only shocked the Tibetan commander, but Li Sai as well. Even so, his reaction was not slowed in the slightest. Bang! The knees of the Vajra Guardian went soft and its body bent. Li Sai swung his sword as if he was sundering the mountains and rivers, and with a squelch, a head went flying. The massive Xianxia Vajra Guardian instantly fell apart, leaving behind a headless corpse to topple to the ground. Silence. Absolute silence. All around the battlefield were faces as pale as snow. All the Tibetans had been struck dumb by this sight. "Milord! How is this possible? How could this be? This is impossible." A moment ago, their commander had been pressing down on that great Tang expert, but in the next moment, His head had been severed, his corpse lying on the floor. The discrepancy was so great that the morale of the Tibetans watching this fight completely collapsed. "It's over," Wang Chong mentally said with a cold sneer, then drew back his gaze. He had the insight and experience of a Saint Martial Realm expert, lacking only the strength. But Li Sai did have the adequate strength. If the two of them working together still weren't able to kill that Tibetan commander, then that Tibetan really would have something to be proud about. Someone who not even the future war saint and invincible great general of the Great Tang could defeat truly deserved to be arrogant. Alas, Li Sai still hasn't matured enough. Otherwise, my help wouldn't have been necessary. As this thought flew through Wang Chong's mind, he quickly turned around and waved his hand. "Old Eagle, hurry up and finish off your opponent." The Tibetan commander had been killed, the world-famous echelon formation had been broken, and only 1,500 of the initial 3,000 cavalry remained. Moreover, Zhao Jingdian and the rest of Wang Chong's forces had arrived. Wang Chong could see no avenue through which these Tibetans could reverse the tides. "Congratulations to you, sir. For defeating renowned Tibetan General Batunlu, you are awarded 3 destiny energy, to be dispensed after the mission is completed." Just when Wang Chong was turning around, he heard a voice in his ear. "Eh?" Wang Chong stopped and mentally gasped in surprise. This voice had truly caught him by surprise, but the most important part, was that Wang Chong knew of this general. It was him? Wang Chong wondered in shock. Wang Chong knew that this general couldn't possibly be anyone nameless, but he hadn't imagined that he would be this famous. Batunlu was not a name that could compare to the likes of Huashu Huizong, Daluan Ruozhen, and Zheluo Feng, but he was definitely one of the higher-ranked individuals of Yusang's Ngari royal lineage. This person was a capable commander in the War of the Southwest, playing an extremely important role for the Tibetan army and even obtaining Huashu Huizong's trust. If nothing unusual had happened, he would have become Huashu Huizong's trusted lieutenant after this battle. But he would only have begun to stand out and become known after this battle. By relying on his performance in the Southwest campaign, Batunlu quickly rose through the ranks of the Tibetan army, even leading an army together with Dusong Mangpoj and the rest to invade the Central Plains and become a major foe of the Great Tang. Wang Chong had not expected that he and Li Sai would kill Batunlu in this battle. Rumble. With the rumbling of war horses, Zhao Jingdian's forces quickly joined the fray. Without the advantage of speed and with no leader to guide them, the Tibetans were doomed. 15 minutes later, the battle was over. Limbs and corpses littered the ground, and no living Tibetan could be seen. 1,000 Great Tang soldiers had fought against 3,000 fully armored Tibetans charging at maximum speed. But it was the Great Tang that ended up thrashing its opponent. No one could have expected this. "How did you do it?" When the battle was over and the army was beginning to clean up the battlefield, Wang Chong heard a voice from behind him. Turning around, he saw that Li Sai was walking toward him, his massive sword on his back. "With your cultivation, it's not possible for you to see the openings of a profound martial realm expert. How did you do it?" Li Sai looked at Wang Chong, his expression unprecedentedly grave. He rarely asked Wang Chong questions, but this matter was completely different. Although he was at the profound martial realm in that fight, even he had been clueless as to how to kill his opponent. Perhaps he could have accepted the results if Wang Chong had also been a profound martial realm expert. But he absolutely was not. A beginner warrior, an entire cultivation realm below, was able to instruct a profound martial realm expert in killing an even more formidable opponent. This was as absurd as a 3-year-old child telling an old veteran how to kill another old veteran on the battlefield. Even Li Sai found it difficult to accept. "Haha, what are you saying? Weren't you the one that killed him? Why are you asking me?" Wang Chong chuckled, feigning confusion. Li Sai only stared at Wang Chong, but the serious expression on his face plainly communicated his stance. He was not making a joke, and Wang Chong's words wouldn't be able to trick him. He had to know how Wang Chong had done it. "Haha, it really wasn't much. The Xianxia Vajra Guardian might have 6 arms, but its body is too large and there are some places it can't reach. I heard my master talk about this sort of martial art before, so I knew of it. All I did this time was pass on that knowledge to you, Wang Chong said with a chuckle. Your master. Li Sai frowned as he began to digest this answer. The master Wang Chong spoke of should be the mysterious black-robed elder living in the spirit vein. He had once visited the spirit vein, and the only person he couldn't see through there was the demonic emperor old man who was Wang Chong's master. Unlike others, Li Sai was a soldier, so he didn't differentiate between righteous and evil. If it was as Wang Chong said, then everything was understandable. But Li Sai still felt that something wasn't right, though he couldn't pinpoint where. Haha. Don't think about it too much. This is also luck. There's a big battle ahead of us. You should get yourself ready. Wang Chong patted Li Sai on the shoulder and turned back around, headed toward the corpse of the Tibetan commander Batunlu. Although the battle was over, there were still spoils to reap. Wang Chong had a feeling that there was an extra reward on the body of this Tibetan commander. I hope my guess is right, Wang Chong said to himself. The higher the status of an expert, the more likely it was to find decent items on their person. Just the golden gauntlets on Batunlu's hands alone were quite the excellent treasure. Batunlu's corpse lay rigidly on the blood-soaked ground, surrounded by the corpses of countless other Tibetans and horses. Although his head had been cut off, Batunlu's fallen body still gave off an intimidating aura. Wang Chong stopped next to Batunlu's body. Unlike the people of the Central Plains, Tibetans had little property, as they were far less prosperous. However, Tibetans had a habit of keeping all their valuable property with them. They didn't have fixed dwellings, so they brought their belongings with them wherever they went. Wang Chong hesitated for a few moments over Batunlu's blood-stained corpse before taking off those golden gauntlets. So heavy! Wang Chong weighed the gauntlets in his hand. Although they didn't appear very large, they probably weighed more than 30 jin. Wang Chong's judgment had been correct. The material these gauntlets were made of really was inferior to Li Sai's Wuxia steel sword. The surface of the golden gauntlets was covered in tiny cracks from the impacts. However, despite their appearance, that they had been able to withstand a full-force blow from Li Sai's Wuxia steel sword was a testament to their strength. And besides, who had as many Wuxia steel weapons as he did? As he flipped the gauntlets over, Wang Chong noticed a small symbol of a white mountain at the ends of the gauntlets. It really is a product of the Great Snow Mountain Holy Land. Wang Chong nodded his head. The Yusang Empire had only one Great Snow Mountain Holy Land, and it had a long and storied heritage. All the supreme weapons of the Yusang Empire were made there. In addition, the Great Snow Mountain Holy Land actually had a very low production rate, though each item it produced was of top quality. Purely by seeing the symbol of the Great Snow Mountain, Wang Chong could guarantee that these gauntlets were not just special because of their toughness. I can give these gauntlets to Old Eagle, Wang Chong quietly said to himself. He wasn't prepared to use these gauntlets himself. It had never been his style to fight openly and without subterfuge. Neither he nor Li Sai were suitable to use these gauntlets, but Old Eagle could make use of them. Moreover, Old Eagle was already at Tier 9 of the true martial realm, only one step away from the profound martial realm. These gauntlets would be of great assistance in his activities. Putting the gauntlets away, Wang Chong paused for a moment before quickly beginning to search through Batunlu's body. He didn't believe that a Tibetan commander like Batunlu only had these gauntlets. After a while, Wang Chong creased his brow. Strange. Could he not have it? There were two objects that Wang Chong had hoped to find on Batunlu's body. One was the Xianxia secret art that had stimulated his potential and rapidly increased his strength so that he could suppress Li Sai. Although this art was difficult to practice, once one succeeded, it could serve as a second chance at life at certain moments. Even in the Yusang Empire, this secret art was only circulated to a select few. The other one was the method for the six-armed Xianxia Vajra Guardian that Batunlu had used. Upon using this supreme art, one's entire body would become as hard as steel and one's strength would swell. If Li Sai had not been carrying that Wuxia steel sword that Wang Chong had specially forged for him, itself incredibly sharp and additionally covered by all sorts of inscriptions, he would have been killed. That he had been able to not die was impressive enough. But Wang Chong had been unable to find either of these technique manuals on Batunlu's body. That's impossible. Yusang doesn't pass down these techniques orally. All their martial arts are passed down through secret manuals. If Batunlu knew these two supreme arts, there's no reason for those manuals to not be on his body. Wang Chong quietly said to himself. The method that Tibetans used to pass down their martial arts was completely different from the Central Plains. They would inscribe the techniques on a very special and refined material, utilizing golden and silver powder, thick with the aura of Buddhism. In Yusang, these items that passed down their techniques through the ages were called Bon Ka. All their martial arts were written on these Bon Ka 1. And given that Batunlu was a commander, he had to have obtained a Bon Ka to learn the techniques that he had learned, or else once had access to one. After searching through Batunlu's body, Wang Chong quickly turned his gaze to Batunlu's horse. If those items weren't on Batunlu's body, they might be hidden on his horse. But after a few moments, Wang Chong was disappointed once more. That's impossible. Where was I wrong? Could it be that Batunlu really doesn't have those secret martial arts manuals on him? Wang Chong rubbed his chin, a look of doubt in his eyes. He originally believed that Batunlu would hide those items under his horse's saddle. But his search had turned up nothing. It appeared that he wouldn't be able to obtain Batunlu's Xianxia secret art and six-armed Xianxia Vajra guardian technique. But then Wang Chong's gaze swept over Batunlu's boots, and he was suddenly struck by an idea. Batunlu's boots looked somewhat different from normal boots. Wang Chong was also wearing a pair of war boots, and he was aware of how thick they were. But Batunlu's boots were clearly a little thicker. Could it be? With this thought, Wang Chong suddenly lowered his body and began to carefully cut away at the edge of the boots with his Wuxia steel sword. Plop! As he cut away at the boot, something dropped out from it and onto the ground. It was a brightly colored object, and after a more careful look, it appeared to be a golden picture scroll that was made of some material between silk and cloth. It really was there. Wang Chong's eyes brightened as he inwardly rejoiced. He picked up that thick golden picture scroll and slowly unfurled it. What greeted him was a black-skinned, six-armed Xianxia stepping over dried bones. Black clouds overhead while flames raged on his body. He had an expression of fury and seemed ready to leap out of the scroll. It really is the Xianxia Vajra guardian. He actually hid it so well. Wang Chong roared with laughter. A renowned general like Batunlu really did have some valuable items on him. He had just hidden them very well. If he hadn't noticed that his boots had been a little thicker than normal, he would have never considered that place a potential hiding spot. That's right. There's still another boot. With gusto, Wang Chong took up his Wuxia steel sword and began to cut away at the bottom of Batunlu's remaining boot. Just as he suspected, the Xianxia secret art that Batunlu used to stimulate his potential had been hidden in the lower layer of his left boot. Unlike the Xianxia Vajra guardian technique, Batunlu's Xianxia secret art was written on a thin and square sheet of paper, densely covered in squiggly Tibetan words. Thankfully, I learned Tibetan in my last life, otherwise these two techniques would be useless to me. Wang Chong rejoiced as he glanced over the paper. These two techniques had both been written in Tibetan, a writing system completely different from that of the Central Plains. If he didn't understand this language, his owning these two manuals would be like a hero without a place to display their talents. Old Eagle. After putting away these two manuals, Wang Chong stood up and called for Old Eagle, upon which he suddenly heard a boom in his mind. Warning! Important event. The Anan Protectorate Army has suffered large losses and Lion City is about to fall, counting down from 3 days. If user is not within 500 li of Lion City 3 days from now, user will fail the mission and be completely obliterated. The icy and mechanical voice of the Stone of Destiny spoke. Wang Chong's body shivered as that frigid voice rang through his mind, and all the blood seemed to recede from his face. How can it be? Wang Chong's face was ghastly pale. This hadn't been his first time hearing a warning from the Stone of Destiny in the last few days. This warning voice didn't normally appear, but when it did, it meant that something big was about to happen. Lion City was built by Xianxia. It's a nigh impregnable fortress and has 80,000 soldiers standing guard. How could it be broken? Wang Chong didn't dare to believe his ears. He had expended a vast sum of gold on this city. The outer walls were plated with iron and inscribed with countless toughening inscriptions. The walls were also smooth and steep, making them impossible to climb. Wang Chong had built it for the express purpose of war, to provide a fortress for the Annan Protectorate army. In reality, this city had been effective. In this period of time, the only reason Wang Chong had been able to leisurely spend a great deal of time training his soldiers through actual combat was that Wang Chong firmly believed that Lion City wouldn't be broken for some time. But everything appeared to have changed. What exactly happened in the south? Wang Chong wondered, his complexion still not having recovered. The joy that came from defeating Batunlu and his 3,000 Tibetans had vanished. At this moment, a terrible sense of danger had dropped down from the heavens and enveloped Wang Chong. Wang Chong looked into the distance, and though he couldn't see anything from where he was, he could feel that dark clouds were sweeping in from the south. The Southwest campaign was progressing faster than he had imagined. That Shenyu Zhongtong had been defeated was already an incontrovertible fact. No matter what sort of plans he had for this war and the Empire's future, if he didn't get to the Arai Plains in 3 days, he would be dead. Something must have happened in the south that he was not aware of, but Wang Chong couldn't understand what it could be. What could inflict so many losses on Lion City? "Young master, what's wrong?" A concerned voice came from behind him. Old Eagle was walking over, a worried look on his face. He had been paying attention to Wang Chong for a little while and noticed that Wang Chong had been standing motionless, his face deathly pale. There was no way this condition was normal, and it wasn't strange for it to make Old Eagle concerned. "It's nothing." Wang Chong placed Batunlu's golden gauntlets in Old Eagle's hands. "These gauntlets are for you." With these words, he strode forward and flipped onto his horse, after which he raised his arm. "All troops, heed my orders. Put down everything and prepare to advance at full speed." Everyone was flabbergasted at this order. These corpses hadn't even been buried yet, so why were they so suddenly moving out? But even though they were confused, they still immediately began to mount their horses and move out. Li Sai rode his horse over and asked, "What's happened?" He similarly felt that something was off about Wang Chong. "Something's happened up ahead. We have to move out immediately." "Old Eagle, have you found out where Commandant Su is?" Wang Chong asked. Old Eagle nodded. "Let's go." Here was a tall mountain, the forest growing thick around it. A tanned man with a black mustache, dressed in the armor of a great Tang commandant, stood at the summit of the mountain, letting the howling winds blow around him. There were actually very few mountain ranges of significant height in the southwest, and this mountain was unquestionably the tallest of them. By standing here, he could see any movement in the surrounding area. This was also why he had chosen to set up his camp here. Strange. Su Shiping stood on the summit, attended by 2 guards. He looked into the distance, squinting in confusion. "Have you figured out what's going on?" "Yes, sir. It's not a trap. Batunlu really has withdrawn, but we do not know why." "You didn't follow to see where they were going?" We were worried that it was a trick, so we didn't follow them very far. We only carefully inspected the surroundings to determine that there was no ambush. After confirming this, we came back. The captain of the scouts said respectfully, bowing, "I understand. You're dismissed." Su Shiping frowned and quickly ordered the scout captain to leave. Batunlu had clearly been about to attack, but he inexplicably disappeared. There was clearly something bizarre going on. But this wasn't Su Shiping's greatest concern. As his gaze swept over the lush forest and his vigilant army, a hint of deep worry flashed through his eyes. These people were those he had gathered from all over in this period of time and now totaled 5,000. But the increase in numbers was of no relief to Su Shiping. On the contrary, it only made him more confused and uneasy. General Li was already dead. The most brilliant rising star of the empire had died on the journey south. Even though he had warned the general, he had still not been able to stop the 60,000 soldiers of the army from being crushed by the Tibetans. And there was an even greater danger to the southwest. In his 20 years in the army, he had participated in all kinds of battles, big and small, and experienced all sorts of dangers. But Su Shiping would never dare to claim that he had encountered a danger as enormous as this one. The 300,000 troops of Meng Shizhao had joined with the 200,000 cavalry of the Yusangari royal lineage and defeated the 180,000 soldiers of the Annan Protectorate army on the Arai plains. This was a peril that the empire had never experienced in all its history. The door to the southwest was open, and the hundreds of thousands of civilians were exposed to the horse hooves of foreign kingdoms. The Great Tang's several centuries of peace was about to suffer its first heavy blow. As for him and the Great Tang soldiers he had gathered here, they were faced with a dilemma. Death faced them both ahead and behind. If they advanced, what awaited them was a 500,000-man army. 5,000 soldiers trying to stop the combined army of Meng Shizhao and Yusang was like a grasshopper trying to stop a carriage, only seeking its own destruction. As for retreating, military orders were as weighty as a mountain. Their purpose had been to reinforce the Annan Protectorate army, and their mission was not complete, their objective not even reached. How could they retreat? Moreover, uncountable numbers of Tibetan cavalry were waiting for them. Reporting. Enemies sighted. A whistle suddenly came from a lookout post that had been set up halfway up the mountain. This voice immediately stirred Su Shiping from his stupor. At the same time, the more than 5,000 Great Tang soldiers began to move. With squeaks and crunches, they aimed all their weaponry toward their surroundings as the atmosphere instantly became tense. Gallop! Their opponents had come even faster than imagined. A great plume of dust could be seen in the distance, a flood of steel approaching with a shocking momentum. "My lord, the Tibetans are already here. What should we do next?" A group of subordinates looked toward Su Shiping. Their opponent had earlier withdrawn without a battle, so they must have made some preparations before coming again. Things seemed ominous for the Great Tang soldiers. "My lord, give the order. We're willing to be suicide soldiers." The various vice-commandants and officers of the army voiced their agreement. Based on the plans they had made beforehand, only by forming a squad of suicide soldiers and throwing it into a frenzied assault would this army be able to stop the Tibetan offensive. This was the only strategy that offered any possibility of survival, but all the members of the suicide squad would be sacrificed and never be able to return. There was no doubt about that. But now everyone was asking to join the suicide squad. Wait a moment. Su Shiping looked into the distance, continuing to hold off on the order. These were all brothers who he had struggled on the battlefield together with. How could he be willing to send them to their deaths? "My lord, the situation can change if we're slow to react. Quickly." The group of vice-commandants and officers anxiously said. Su Shiping continued to look silently into the distance. "Ah, he who is indecisive when a decision is needed is certain to meet disaster. Brothers, let's go." The officers began to move, resolved to no longer wait for Su Shiping's order. They began to form a suicide squad to charge into the Tibetan army before it began to charge. "Wait a moment. My lord, since you're not willing, we'll make the decision for you." "I said wait. These aren't Tibetans. They're on our side," Su Shiping exclaimed. His words instantly plunged the surroundings into silence. Everyone stared at Su Shiping, dumbfounded. On our side? Where could people from our side have come from at this time? From all that dust being stirred up and that surging momentum, a rather significant force is approaching. Where did the Great Tang get a reinforcing army like that? But they realized very quickly that their judgments had been wrong. "Look over there. It's our flag. They really are on our side," one of the soldiers shouted, and the rest quickly turned to that tide of steel. What they saw was the black war banner of the Great Tang extending out of that army, fluttering in the wind. "They really are on our side." As the cavalry got closer and closer, the soldiers were able to more clearly make them out. They began to cheer, all the tension from a moment ago disappearing in a puff of smoke. The cavalry galloped forward towards Su Shiping's camp, Wang Chong at the front, Li Sai on his left and Old Eagle on his right. Upon seeing how heavily that mountain had been fortified, Wang Chong couldn't help but sigh in praise. He finally understood why that Commandant Su had inspired such trust in the reinforcement army. He also understood why Batunlu had decided to first deal with him instead of exterminating this camp. It wasn't merely because the force on this mountain was larger, numbering 5,000 to 6,000, but because Commandant Su had an astounding ability to organize his forces that left a very deep impression. His fortification of the mountain was extremely sturdy and tight. Not even Batunlu would be able to find any weaknesses to exploit. So many supply wagons and weapons, and he even dug out a moat around the mountain. Even I would have to think carefully before making an attack. Wang Chong gazed at that distant camp, mentally sighing in praise. In his journey southward, he had only accumulated a few of those heavy and lethal ballistae. But on that hill, he could see numerous gleams of cold light aimed in the direction of his forces. On second look, there were dozens of ballistae, perhaps exceeding 100. These defensive weapons were sufficient to deal a heavy blow to any cavalry force. This alone was enough, but Wang Chong had also seen a large moat dug out at the base of the mountain, 5 to 6 zhang wide and 2 to 3 zhang deep. This moat nearly surrounded the entire the mountain. The Tibetan army consisted almost exclusively of cavalry, so they might have been able to disregard those lethal ballistae. But even the best steed wouldn't be able to cross that moat in a single leap. Moreover, Wang Chong also noticed that a forest of spears had been planted at the bottom of the moat. One could easily imagine what would happen if a warhorse jumped into the moat. Wang Chong had been hearing about this Commandant Su for some time now, but it now seemed that Commandant Su was far more formidable than he had imagined. He's really got the style of a veteran officer. This thought flashed through Wang Chong's mind as he gazed at that bearded and tanned commandant standing at the peak of the mountain. There were many veteran officers in the army. They might not have been particularly strong martial artists, but they made up for it with their rich store of experience. They fought calmly and steadily, weren't impatient to advance, and demanded stability and composure. There was no question that Commandant Su was one of these composed and steady veteran officers. Wang Chong didn't lack experts with potential, but what he did lack were reliable veteran officers who could lead troops into the battle and assist his own army. Wang Chong was feeling more and more certain that his decision had been correct. Lower the drawbridge. From the distance came a sonorous voice, like a giant bell, after which came a rumble as the massive trunk of a tree came crashing down, bridging the moat. Wang Chong immediately urged his horse over the trunk, bringing several of his followers with him to the peak. At the summit, Wang Chong finally met Commandant Su. He was very tall and far bullier than Wang Chong had imagined. His face was covered in wrinkles and worn down from the hardships of many years. However, the part that left the deepest impression was his erect posture. His body seemed to be packed with an energy that soared straight into the heavens and was as weighty as a mountain. It was a strength that one could trust, could rely on. It was like as long as this person stood there, no matter how great the trial or how furious the storm, they would be able to grit their teeth and endure through it. Might I ask young master's name? Su Shiping was also taking measure of Wang Chong. Given the mighty momentum with which this force had come, Su Shiping had believed that their leader would be some famous general in the army, or maybe a veteran general or officer. But Su Shiping discovered that what awaited him under that blood-speckled armor was a surprisingly young face. But despite the young face, Su Shiping was able to sense the aura of a great general in this youth. A perseverance, courage, composure, and confidence that far surpassed his age. This aura often made one unconsciously disregard the youth of his face and treat him as someone beyond his years. Wang Chong looked down at Su Shiping from his horse, silently taking a golden token from his belt and raising it high over his head. Su Shiping squinted at it. This is His Highness King Song. Upon seeing that dragon on the token, he paled and immediately bowed. I didn't know that young master was His Highness King Song's subordinate. I did not go out to greet young master, and I hope that I can be forgiven. We request young master to forgive this offense. The officers around Su Shiping also nervously began to bow. In the military, no matter the region or faction, King Song of the Great Tang held an influential position, receiving the respect of all soldiers. In the imperial court, King Song had always been a staunch supporter of the army. In this aspect, None of the other imperial princes of the Great Tang could compare to King Song. Moreover, this was an imperial prince, with the blood of the true dragon running through his veins. This was not a status that anyone present could match. Old Eagle suddenly rode his horse forward and spoke. My young master is Duke Zhou's grandson, a descendant of the Wang clan. His birth name is Wang Chong. You should have heard of him through the regional commander's incident. Buzz. In an instant, everyone began to look differently at Wang Chong. Even Su Shiping couldn't help but give him a second look, his face brimming with surprise. So it was young Master Wang. My apologies. Su Shiping gave a deep bow, his voice suffused with his hard-gained respect. His respect from before had been purely toward King Song's status, with Wang Chong serving as King Song's proxy, but the respect he gave now was utterly different. The regional commander's incident had caused such a stir that all of society knew of it. There was practically no soldier who wasn't aware of what had happened back then. In that incident, Wang Chong had both proved himself and won the respect of the world. Now that they knew that this youth was Wang Chong, everything was different. At the very least, there was no problem with his wielding King Song's token. Young Master Wang, our apologies. The surrounding officers also bowed in respect. The atmosphere had undergone a massive transformation. Old Eagle silently nodded. Wang Chong was still too young, and this youth would serve as a barrier to his ventures. Even with King Song's token, these soldiers still wouldn't be completely willing to listen to him. So he had revealed Wang Chong's identity. For what reason has young master crossed these vast distances to come here? Su Shiping asked in confusion. Wang Chong raised up King Song's token and sternly said, Commandant Su, I'll get straight to the point. Carrying out King Song's order, I came here to take command of this army. Starting from this point, everyone must listen to my orders. Buzz. All the officers were dumbfounded. Young Master Wang, please forgive me for speaking out of turn. Given young master's reputation, it is no problem for young master to command this army. But if I can be forgiven for asking this question, other than the forces present, has the imperial court sent any other reinforcements? The officer asking glanced at the several thousand troops at the base of the mountain as he spoke, a tiny sliver of hope in his eyes. A similar hope appeared in the eyes of the other officers. This question also happened to be the one weighing on their minds. The Empire's southwest was in complete disarray. Only by dispatching a new batch of reinforcements could the situation be altered. This had been the greatest hope of these soldiers as they entrenched this area. Wang Chong shook his head and calmly said, There is none. It's just us. There was nothing to hide by this point, and by bringing it up earlier, it could save Wang Chong a lot of trouble in the future. Although he also wanted to say that a large number of reinforcements was on its way, in reality, the imperial court had no ability to send anyone else, at least for some time. Only by clearly stating the current circumstances and gathering opinions would there be a chance of altering the situation. Ah! The officers began to sigh, disappointment appearing in their eyes. Even Su Shiping appeared dejected. Wang Chong had come with mighty momentum and carried King Song's token from the distant capital. These soldiers had originally believed that the imperial court had sent a large force, Wang Chong's troops being merely the vanguard. But no one had expected Wang Chong to say that his forces were all that was coming. The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. The summit of the mountain was quiet, the entire place drowned in a deathly stillness. But, young master, if the imperial court has not sent reinforcements, the small number of forces we have here would be like a cup of water on a burning carriage. It's far from enough to alter the situation in the southwest. An officer couldn't help but vent his disappointment through his words. Young Master Wang, I won't hide anything from you. The Tibetans are currently operating at full power. We might have 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers here, but we can only barely manage to defend this place. It's far from enough to actually advance. Just those 3,000 Tibetan cavalry waiting outside were impossible for us to deal with. That force is extremely formidable, and if we leave this place and the geographic advantage it offers, the Tibetans will attack us midway, instantly inflicting heavy casualties on our forces. In addition, cavalry are much faster than infantry, so we wouldn't even be able to escape. Su Shiping looked up to the skies and gave a long sigh, an expression of helplessness on his face. How could he be willing to defend this place? How could he not want to do more? But the situation was stronger than the man. If he risked advancing, he might not only fail to aid the Anan Protectorate army, but many of the brothers at his side might die without a place of burial. As a commander, he could not betray the trust of his brother. Ha ha ha! It would have been fine if Su Shiping had not said anything, but upon hearing about those 3,000 Tibetan cavalry, Old Eagle, Li Sai, and the other guards who had followed Wang Chong up the mountain began to roar with laughter. Even Wang Chong couldn't suppress a faint smile. "Commandant, are you talking about this man?" Rather than acting modest, Old Eagle roared with laughter as he threw a prepared metal box over. The box opened, and a round head flew out, rolling on the ground until it gradually came to a stop. As if an invisible hand had clamped onto everyone's necks, the mountaintop instantly fell silent. The officers stared with eyes wide and mouths agape at that head, which clearly belonged to someone from the plateau despite the blood and dirt that caked it. A few of the soldiers who were standing near it even took a few steps back. This is Batunlu. Isn't this that Tibetan general? How could this be? How did he die? How is this possible? They had so few people, so how did they manage to kill Batunlu? The soldiers gawked at the head on the ground. They could not comprehend that the Tibetan cavalry that had been their mortal foes, that roamed around their perimeter in a threatening manner before mysteriously retreating not too long ago, had all been killed. And they had been killed by this army, by the forces of the Great Tang. An officer raised his head and asked, "What about his soldiers?" Although he knew those soldiers probably hadn't had good fates, he still couldn't help but ask. "Dead, of course. Even the head of their commander is here. Do you think we could have done that if we hadn't killed all of them?" Li Sai impatiently said. He was a military man and the model for a candid general. He wasn't much for schemes and also didn't have much patience. No one argued with Li Sai. Su Shiping exchanged looks with his old subordinates, all of them speechless. This result had caught them completely off guard. None of them would have expected it in their wildest dreams. In order to deal with those Tibetans, they had acted like they were facing a powerful foe. They had gathered a large number of soldiers, constructed many fortifications, and spent many days preparing. Just a few moments ago, they had even been discussing setting up a suicide squad to sacrifice their lives for a sliver of hope. No one had imagined that while they were planning for the worst-case scenario, their powerful foe had already been eliminated. And the ones who had killed them were this young man and the soldiers at his side. Even though he knew of Wang Chong's reputation, Su Shiping's mind was still in turmoil. This was actual combat, a life-or-death struggle. Even though he came from a clan of ministers and generals, wasn't he still just a child? How had he managed to pull it off? Su Shiping suddenly realized that he understood nothing about this youth standing before him. "Young Master Wang, can I ask how you managed to defeat them?" Su Shiping asked. "Tibetans are insufficient below 1,000, invincible above it." This was a saying spread throughout every country. Although it sounded rather exaggerated, it clearly communicated the ferocity and abnormal fighting power of the Tibetans. 3,000 Tibetan cavalry were a fighting force capable of fighting 7,000 or 8,000 soldiers. It wasn't that he didn't believe Wang Chong. This feat was just too stunning. Wang Chong faintly smiled, unsurprised by their shock. Once the Tibetan echelon formation reached its maximum speed, it truly was very difficult to deal with. There were no records of someone able to defeat the Tibetans in a head-on confrontation. Even Geshu Han had to use the astonishing tower shields. It was very normal for these officers to find this news difficult to accept. Old Eagle. Wang Chong took a few steps back and glanced at Old Eagle. Old Eagle understood and gave a detailed description of the battle, naturally making sure to include all the thrilling parts. The surname Wang wasn't enough to convince these soldiers. Only by properly illustrating Wang Chong's strength could they be thoroughly persuaded. This was to the advantage of both Wang Chong and the soldiers. "It's a Wuxia steel sword." Su Shiping returned the Wuxia steel sword to Wang Chong and turned back to look speechlessly at his subordinates. They had naturally heard of the Wuxia steel swords, but they didn't expect them to be so powerful in the hands of an army. 1,000 against 3,000 in a frontal charge, and they had managed to break through and achieve victory. Old Eagle's account had caused shivers to run through their bodies. Young Master Wang is from a prestigious clan and also has King Song's token. We soldiers naturally have no problem. In the future, we will follow your orders without question. Su Shiping and his old officers lowered their heads in heartfelt sincerity. A person who could create such a victory on the battlefield was not someone who could be evaluated using common sense. Even if Wang Chong were even younger, he still possessed a talent for command and leadership that far surpassed everyone present. Not even Su Shiping would have any objections if this person took the reins of his army. I originally believed that no one would be able to surpass General Li. I didn't think that the Wang clan would give birth to such a descendant. It's no wonder King Song could rest easy and give his token to him. Perhaps giving him command of the soldiers is actually the best choice. Su Shiping mentally said to himself. Wang Chong had truly won their trust and respect, not through his status or character, but his talent for military affairs. As Wang Chong quietly observed the looks of the soldiers from his horse, he knew that he had finally won over these soldiers, and his lips curled into a smile. His greatest problem at the moment was that his forces were too small. With these 5,000 soldiers, his plans had a much greater chance of success. The reorganization of the soldiers progressed much faster than anticipated. With a veteran officer like Su Shiping present, Wang Chong needed only let him handle it all for everything to proceed smoothly. Not even Old Eagle, Li Sai, or Zhao Jingdian would have been able to pull off this feat, so Wang Chong decided to put Zhao Jingdian at Su Shiping's side. Although Su Shiping wasn't a powerful warrior, he had a great deal of experience. Exactly what the young Zhao Jingdian was currently lacking. Wang Chong hoped that Su Shiping would train Zhao Jingdian. Wang Chong also managed to learn a great deal about the current state of the Southwest from Su Shiping. Young master, take a look. The road south is currently more difficult than you might have imagined. Once the soldiers were done reorganizing, Wang Chong, Zhao Jingdian, Li Sai, Old Eagle, Su Shiping, and the other officers convened a meeting at the summit. In front of them was a large model. Su Shiping extended a finger and pointed out several places on the model. It wasn't only Batunlu. The Tibetans left many more forces on the road to the south. Here, here, and here. All of these places have large numbers of Tibetan soldiers. There are at least 6,000 soldiers in each area, and all of them have fierce commanders even stronger than Batunlu, and all of them are guarding strategic passes. If we want to reach Shirai and reinforce the Annan Protectorate army, we'll have to go through them. But our forces alone are completely insufficient. Su Shiping made no attempts to conceal his concerns. This task was easier said than done. Even though Wang Chong had killed Batunlu, it had not in the slightest improved the situation in the southwest. Although Huashu Huaizong has already returned to the south, he still left sufficient forces behind. These people don't kill or plunder, only stand guard over these passes to prevent any help from the imperial court from arriving. I heard a rumor that the Ngari Great Minister Daluan Ruozan once studied in the Great Tang and that he took many strategy books with him when he left, a part of which he gave to Huashu Huaizong. Huashu Huaizong's martial arts are secondary in importance, but with his grasp on strategy, he's not just some simple warrior. Wang Chong silently thought to himself. Tibetans were fierce and courageous fighters, but they were also unrestrained. That Huashu Huaizong was able to command his soldiers to strictly follow his orders in a non-combat situation was proof enough that Huashu Huaizong's abilities were worthy of his respect. It's a powerful foe, Wang Chong silently said to himself as he gazed at the model. The places Huashu Huaizong had garrisoned his soldiers were easy to defend and hard to attack, and all of them were places that needed to be passed through. As long as soldiers stood guard at these places, anyone who wanted to reinforce the Annan Protectorate army, whether they were sent by the imperial court or someone else, wouldn't be able to detour around them. If they were facing a small force, these garrisons would be able to completely annihilate the enemy. And if it was a large force, Zheluofeng and Huashu Huaizong would be informed as quickly as possible and be able to prepare themselves. These places are all of high elevation, and given the abilities of the Tibetans, they're definitely occupying the summit. This offers them a high vantage point with which to spot the enemy and also facilitates their charges. Charging down the mountain will allow the Tibetan highland steeds to reach their maximum speed as quickly as possible, truly making them difficult to defeat. As for those at the base of the mountain, both infantry and cavalry will find it hard to gain speed, making their opponents even more difficult to deal with. Wang Chong's mind was restless, his brow slightly furrowing in thought. Do you know who's leading these soldiers that Huashu Huizong left behind? Wang Chong suddenly asked. Bashishing, a tanned vice-commandant immediately offered. He was responsible for the scouts, so he clearly understood the situation. This person is one of Huashu Huizong's 5 tiger generals. In terms of strength, he's probably much stronger than the deceased Batunlu. Moreover, unlike Batunlu, he's an excellent commander, and he's incredibly skilled at breaking through defenses. He's both brave and wise. When General Li remained to hold the enemy back by offering himself as bait, he formed his soldiers into one of the most powerful defensive formations, the Golden Fortress Formation, to tightly surround him. But that Bashishing still successfully led his soldiers in breaking through the defense and shattering the Golden Fortress Formation. General Li was famous for his Golden Fortress Formation, an officer added. Using that formation, he was able to defend against many foes in Anxi and Baiting. But I didn't think that it would be broken by the Tibetans on this journey south. At the mention of the deceased Li Zhengyi, everyone felt a great sorrow. Wang Chong was also slightly moved by this recount. He had heard of Li Zhengyi's Golden Fortress Formation. Apparently, Li Zhengyi had come up with the formation himself, and even who great generals like Gao Xianji and Fuming Lingcha had praised it for its toughness. One could just imagine how formidable Li Zhengyi's Golden Fortress Formation must have been to earn the praise of these imperial great generals. And for the Tibetans to break through the Golden Fortress Formation that not even the Turks or the Arabs could break through was a testament to Bashishing's strength. It looks to me that this person has incredible offensive capabilities. He must at least have an offensive war halo that can cover his entire army. Wang Chong quietly said to himself. Although Li Zhengyi had lost, failing to fulfill the imperial decree, he had expressed his sincerity through his death. At a time like this, Wang Chong naturally wouldn't continue to criticize him, and he certainly wouldn't use the occasion to doubt his ability. My apologies. I've made my lord see an unsightly scene, Su Shiping finally said after a few moments. Both he and his fellow officers had regained their composure. Wang Chong waved his hand and calmly said, My lord is too polite. I only have respect for General Li. Su Shiping nodded. My lord, we currently have a severe lack of manpower, and Bashishing is a powerful opponent. Moving south at this time truly isn't a wise move. Your subordinate means that we should prioritize getting in touch with the other troops and wait for reinforcements from the imperial court before considering moving south. Although the 60,000 soldiers of the reinforcement army suffered heavy casualties, quite a few of my brothers managed to survive. Other than our group, we also have people here, here, and here. If we can get in touch with them, we'll at least be able to protect ourselves. Su Shiping's finger drew an arc across the model as he pointed out several locations. If we can get in touch with these areas, we would be able to gather almost 20,000 soldiers, which would be of great help to young master's plans. Wang Chong subconsciously turned his gaze to those places. Slowly, his brow began to crease. Tibetans occupied the areas between all these places, and they were all very far from each other. The farthest was perhaps almost 1,000 li away. It would take an extremely long time to gather all these people, but Wang Chong had only 3 days before Lion City fell, and he had to get there as quickly as possible. My lord, honing the edge won't delay us from cutting firewood, and to act with great haste does not always mean more speed. Your subordinate means that there's no harm in waiting a few more days to gather more soldiers and then make a decision. Su Shiping began to probe. No! Before Su Shiping could finish, Wang Chong frowned and immediately rejected Su Shiping's plan. We cannot delay the move south. It has to be immediately carried out. These words were absolute and brooked no questions. Su Shiping and his officers were left stunned. Wang Chong had always given the impression of a genial and approachable person. None of them had expected him to make decisions with such resolve. Su Shiping brought his head very low and deferentially said, "We will naturally obey my lord's orders." Wang Chong was a descendant of a prestigious clan of ministers and generals, and he had already proved himself by defeating their great foe Batunlu. He also had King Song's token in hand and was this army's highest commander. Su Shiping naturally wouldn't object to Wang Chong's orders at this time. The only reason Yu Sang and Meng Shizhao haven't begun a large-scale mobilization to the north is that Lion City is holding them down. If we don't think of a way to deal with those roadblocks as quickly as possible and get down to the Arai Plains, then once Lion City falls, it won't just be Tibetan cavalry waiting for us at the passes. Right now, it's not a question of if we should take this sort of risk. We don't have a choice. We have to break through. Wang Chong's eyes shone as he explained. "But what do we do about Bashishing?" a commandant said. "This man is powerful and skilled in strategy, and has the geographic advantage of the passes. We alone won't be any match for him." "Humph. Leave that to me." Wang Chong snorted, utterly unconcerned. Bashishing truly was a formidable character, but skilled in strategy? There was no one in this generation who could compare to Wang Chong in strategy. Even the great Tang war god Su Xianxia had lost to him. His battle against Batunlu had already proved his ability to break through more than 1,000 Tibetans, and it was now time for him to prove his skills in strategy. Leading cavalry wasn't his only specialty in war. Inform the army to prepare to move out. You're all dismissed, Wang Chong ordered with a wave of his hand. Rumble. The sound of horses galloping across the earth echoed through the mountains, along with the sounds of high-pitched neighing and the clattering of metal. On the summit of this high peak was a man fully clad in armor, even his face covered in a mask. Only his icy eyes were exposed to the furious gales, their gaze looking down upon the world, sweeping to and fro across the earth. Under this general's feet glimmered a massive halo of thorns, making this general seem like a god. Even the most fearsome of his Tibetan subordinates kept a distance of several zhang from him. None of them dared to get too close, and kept their heads slightly lowered and timid expressions on their faces. "What have you discovered?" Bashishing stood erect on his horse, his droning voice devoid of emotion. Waves of heat spread out from his body, making those nearby feel like they were on fire. "Reporting to my lord, there is no news for the moment. We have already defeated the Tang army, and Longshi's Geshu Han is being held down by the king of generals. The Great Tang has no troops that they can use at the moment. All we need to do is wait for the great minister and general to destroy Lion City, and all of the southwest will be in our Yusang's range." Though the reporting Tibetan commander spoke respectfully, he kept his distance behind Bashishing. Bashishing had an explosive temper and was prone to inflicting corporal punishment on his subordinates. Moreover, he cultivated a fire technique, which further stoked his anger and made him easier to provoke. Although this man was a commander in the army, he did not dare to contend against one of the 5 tiger generals. "Cree!" A shrill cry came from within the clouds, then a green gerfalcon flew out of them. Something's happened. All the commanders on the mountaintop appeared surprised at the sight of this gerfalcon. Meanwhile, Bashishing raised his brows, his eyes spewing out cold light. He had never feared war. On the contrary, he desired it. "Someone, quickly go and see what's going on," a Tibetan military officer ordered one of the nearby elite scouts. "There's no need. Let them come." Bashishing waved his hand, a look of contempt in his eyes. Rumble. It took only a few moments for black tides of steel to quickly come into view, leaving behind clouds of dust as they approached the pass. The black Great Tang war banners waving in the tide indicated who they were. It really is the Great Tang reinforcements. Interesting. Bashishing watched the approaching Tang army, his eyes shining with a cruel light. "My lord, it looks like the remnants of those evil creatures. I didn't think that they would dare approach." Behind him, several officers offered their opinions. "I'd like to see what they plan to do," another officer sneered. At the start, they had believed that the Great Tang had dispatched a new reinforcement army. If that really was the case, then the forces that they had with them truly might be insufficient. But if it was just the remnants of that defeated army, the situation was completely different. They had fought a battle with them not too long ago, so these Tibetans were extremely familiar with their war banners and armor. As the Tibetans silently waited for Tang army to approach, that cloud of dust stopped 30 to 40 li from the mountains. What are those fellows up to? At the summit, the officers frowned, and even Bashishing appeared confused. But before the Tibetans could react, a chorus of neighs came from the distance, and the earth shook once more. The dense ranks of the Tang army were turning around and heading back into the distance. Humph! These craven cowards actually want to run. Haha! I truly did overestimate them. It looks to me that they didn't even think that we would be guarding here. The Tibetan officers suddenly noticed something. Humph! A mix of infantry and cavalry. Do they think they can still run with this kind of army? Bashishing grimly laughed, and with a swish and a burst of sparks, he pulled out the scimitar at his waist, letting its cold edge gleam in the void. Since they've come over, let's go and greet them. All soldiers, hear my order. Blow the horns. Immediately move out and kill them for me. Bashishing's eyes glowed with savagery and cruelty. Boom! As the white yak horn blew, rings of flame bloomed like red lotuses beneath Bashishing's warhorse, enveloping his entire army. It only took a few moments for the 6,000 Tibetan cavalry to feel like their bodies were aflame, and stellar energy flowed more quickly through their bodies. The horses began to neigh as the Tibetan cavalry flew down from the summit like a fierce gale, sending up massive clouds of dust as they pursued Wang Chong's army. At the same time, in a place several dozen li away from the pass being guarded by the Tibetan army, although all was silent, the atmosphere was fraught with tension. "My lord, is this really okay?" Commandant Su asked uneasily from Wang Chong's side. His 5,000 brothers had all followed, and what they were facing was 6,000 elite Tibetan cavalry. This was no joke. Next to him, Zhao Jingdian, Li Sai, and Old Eagle were also in a rather dour mood. Although they wanted to state on Wang Chong's behalf that everything would definitely be okay, not even they had any confidence in this matter. That the Tibetans had waited for so long to finally launch this attack meant that they had clearly come prepared. And everyone present had personally experienced the power of this army. Ha! If we don't try, how can we know if it's okay? It could only be Wang Chong who could still keep such a leisurely and easygoing manner at this time. He had witnessed such scenes far too many times, and though he had the external appearance of a teenager, his mind was far older. "Commandant Su, are all your large shields ready?" Wang Chong asked. Commandant Su immediately gave a nod. "They're all ready. For infantry to contend against those swift and powerful cavalry, those shields were a necessity." Su Shiping had only dared to challenge Batunlu from the mountain because he had gathered crate after crate of hardy large shields. These large shields were originally meant to deal with Batunlu, but they ended up being used by Wang Chong to deal with the even more formidable Bashishing. "Then it's fine." Wang Chong nodded, his expression composed as if everything was going to plan. It was like there was nothing that could ever make him panic. "Old Eagle, can you release your birds and see if Bashishing followed us?" "Yes." Old Eagle quickly sent out a large eagle. After a few moments, a shrill cry echoed through the air. "They've come." Old Eagle's expression grew nervous as he heard this cry. In reality, however, it was more because his sense for danger was growing more and more sensitive as he participated in more battles. Wang Chong waved his right hand and immediately ordered, "Let's go. Follow the plan and head up the mountain." He turned and pointed straight at a distant mountain behind them. In this region, besides the pass guarded by the Tibetans, this mountain was the highest. This mountain wasn't particularly tall, but its walls were extremely steep, making it appear like a massive sword sticking out of the earth. More importantly, the back of this mountain was an extremely tall cliff. Not even the formidable Tibetan cavalry would be able to charge up the back of the mountain. This was the location for battle that Wang Chong had selected after carefully inspecting the model. His army quickly retreated, surging like a tide until it reached the top of the mountain. Rumble! The earth quaked. Not long after Wang Chong's army had retreated, a cloud of dust shrouded the area. In this dust were the 6,000 Tibetan cavalry, galloping forward with all the aggression of a fire. Leading them was Bashishing, only his frigid eyes showing from beneath his heavy armor. Humph, the Tang army is showing a little intelligence this time. Knowing that they can't escape, they decided to just stop running. Bashishing gazed at the distant Tang army ascending the mountain, a mocking smile on his lips. My lord spoke truly. They really are showing some intelligence this time. One of his Tibetan officers agreed. None of these officers had ever heard of 2 legs outrunning 4 legs. It might have been okay if this Tang army had been pure cavalry, but for a mixture of infantry and cavalry to want to flee in front of Tibetan cavalry, that was simply absurd. Although fleeing to the mountain might not guarantee their survival, it was an expedient plan. My lord, do you wish to attack? Another officer behind Bashishing asked. They were currently presented with a superb offensive opportunity. With their force of 6,000 cavalry, they could definitely pulverize that Tang army. There's no need. To their surprise, Bashishing raised an arm and rejected his subordinate's suggestion. Since they can't escape, there's no need to rush. There was a sneer in Bashishing's eyes. We'll stand guard here and wait for General Xianxia Dalu to arrive. Once we meet up with him, then we can attack and get rid of this Tang army. He never did anything without confidence. Although they might be able to charge up and eliminate those Tang soldiers now, if he could lower his own casualties without affecting his chances of success, why wouldn't he? Killing was an art. How to kill as much of the enemy as possible while preserving one's own forces, that was strategy. This was also the principle that he had comprehended from Lord Huashu Huizong's strategy texts. This was also the true reason he could stand together with the rest of the Ngari royal lineage's 5 tiger generals. Yes, my lord. Though his officers were a little surprised, they hurriedly nodded and said no more. My lord, why aren't they attacking? On the mountain, everyone frowned at the strange movements of the Tibetans. Tibetans were a pugnacious people. Once they saw an enemy, they would immediately begin pursuing them, running them down like some vicious dog. Almost everyone in the world knew of this trait of the Tibetans. But for the Tibetans to do nothing with the prey so close was truly abnormal. My lord, will they not come? An officer asked, not knowing whether he should feel happy or disappointed. Relax. He's just waiting for reinforcements. Wang Chong grinned. Know yourself and know your enemy, and you will never be defeated. He actually had a greater understanding of Huashu Huizong's 5 tiger generals than of Batunlu. It was not Bashishing's habit to bide his time when his prey was right in front of him. On the contrary, the fire dog Bashishing was more inclined to chase his foes down, his teeth biting down into their bones, gnawing through their throats, not resting until every last one of his foes stopped breathing. Fire dog Bashishing, it looks like I didn't overestimate you in the slightest. It's no wonder you could break straight through the center of Li Zhengyi's army. You can be considered a top-class member of Yusang's Ngari royal lineage. Wang Chong quietly said to himself as he looked at that abnormally stalwart figure in the distance. Tibetans had relied on their strength, not their strategies, to dominate the world. Strategy and tactics had never been their field of expertise. For the entire Ngari royal lineage to have a scheming minister like Daluan Ruozhen was already rather decent. And Bashishing had been praised by Daluan Ruozhen in Wang Chong's last life, so one could imagine his capabilities. Later on, Wang Chong had also heard about his view of strategy. He had to admit that though Yusang's art of war had originated from the Central Plains, Bashishing had hit the nail on the head with many of his ideas on commanding troops, enough to make many of the Han generals of the Central Plains blush with shame. But that was all. My lord, why don't we attack before the Tibetan reinforcements have arrived and rout them? One of Su Shiping's officers proposed, his expression very nervous. Otherwise, once they combine their armies, we'll be in great danger. No! Wang Chong rejected the idea with a wave of his sleeve. What Bashishing wants is for us to leave the mountain and attack him. If that really does happen, he won't even need reinforcements to crush us. Our forces alone are far from enough to defeat these 6,000 Tibetan cavalry. When one's forces were smaller than the enemy's, one had to find victory through tactics. Fighting the enemy in a head-to-head battle was often the worst plan. Wang Chong had once led a large force of cavalry, so he was well aware that cavalry only grew more powerful as their numbers swelled. And this was no arithmetical change, but a geometric increase. In this situation, a mixed force of 8,000 soldiers going on the offensive was the most foolhardy decision. "My lord, what should we do? There are 2 Tibetan cavalry forces in this area. 6,000 is already hard enough to deal with, but if that additional force of 5,000 arrives, more than 10,000 elite cavalry will doom us for sure." The officer speaking was extremely concerned, his entire face fraught with worry. Batunlu's force of 3,000 had been enough to coop them up in the mountain. Now, with 10,000 Tibetan cavalry, everyone feared that they would be dying without a grave. "No need." Wang Chong leisurely waved his hand. "I have a plan. All you need to do is listen to my orders. Commandant Su, the battle will soon be upon us. I do not want to hear any of these morale-draining words. If something else like this happens again, you know what to do, right?" Wang Chong turned his head to fix the officers with an icy glare. The officers shivered and averted their eyes from this teenager. Benevolence could not be used to command soldiers. War was not a game. Blindly relying on benevolence and conciliation would not unify and intimidate the people. That was a principle of the Confucian, not a strategist. Those who lacked sufficient conviction, persistence, and daring would panic at crucial moments, harming not only themselves but the thousands of soldiers under their command. A commander held the lives of the army in their hands. One who did not understand this principle could not sit on that chair. "My lord, rest easy. Your orders will be strictly carried out. Your subordinate understands what should be done," Commandant Su firmly declared, bowing. Wang Chong nodded slightly and said no more. When Han Xian selects his troops, the more the better one. The difference between 1,000 troops and 8,000 troops was like night and day, as was the difference between utilizing geography and not utilizing geography. Even though Bashishing had come with such an imposing momentum, Wang Chong now commanded 8,000 troops, almost possessing the strength of a division. The might that a regiment of 1,000 troops could display was completely different from the might of a division. Even if he was about to face 5,000 more cavalry, Wang Chong was fearless. In his last life, he had led armies against even more formidable foes. How could he be afraid of some trifling Bashishing? Rumble. Time flew by, and the Tibetan reinforcements arrived much faster than expected. Not even 2 hours later, a plume of dust rose from the east. A flood of steel, consisting of thousands of cavalry, was approaching with a thunderous momentum, the black ancient beast depicted on the Tibetan war banners inspiring dread in the Tang soldiers. "They're here. So fast." On the mountain, everyone looked nervously at the approaching army. Tibetans were all natural cavalrymen. Whether or not they understood strategy, they would always be a most powerful opponent. And nearby, Bashishing's 6,000 cavalry also began to move. Turning, they kicked up clouds of dust as they moved to join up with the approaching force. Under the eyes of the Tang soldiers, these two armies melded into one. The black cavalry formed an intimidatingly vast sea that sent black waves across the earth. Even more shocking was the strict discipline maintained in that army. Xiangyang Dalu clasped his fists and asked with bowed head, "My lord," Xiangyang Dalu reporting. "Everything is as my lord commands." "Does my lord have an order?" Xiangyang Dalu was covered in armor, and he held a pitch-black spear. His body gave off a torrential aura of energy, and one could tell at a glance that he was a valiant general. But even he lowered his head to Bashishing. Bashishing nodded his head in satisfaction. He had the token of great General Huashu Huaizong, allowing him to wield absolute authority here. "It's about time. Ready yourselves, and then we'll go and annihilate the Tang soldiers on the mountain." Bashishing turned his head toward that distant mountain, his eyes glowing with a destructive energy. Since Xiangyang Dalu was already here, he had no more worries. No matter what tricks this Tang army had up its sleeves, no matter how many soldiers they had, the only thing that awaited them was death. Soon after, the deep and desolate horn of the yak blew. With this signal to charge, the vast sea of Tibetan cavalry began to move. The Tibetans began to organize themselves into formation. Their hands gripped the scimitars at their waists, and their cold eyes turned toward the mountain. At this moment, these more than 10,000 Tibetan cavalry were a single unit, acting as one. Those ruthless and bloodthirsty eyes gazed upon those Tang soldiers on the mountain as if they were already dead. At the same time, a murderous and demonic energy began to burst out of their bodies. The more ferocious they were, the thicker their killing intent. And when all their killing intents fused together and soared into the skies, space itself began to twist. The dark clouds of war began to gather from all over, and the air became fraught with tension. Rumble. The army had started at a slow crawl, but as it got faster and faster, the entire earth began to quake. Kill! A scimitar drew an arc through the air, aimed into the distance. It was followed by fierce shouts, and then the army swept across the earth toward the summit. The battle had finally begun. At the same time, when the Tibetan army was beginning its charge, the air on the summit was also fraught with tension. Ready! With this order, the army began to move. Following the contours of the mountain, large metal shields were placed onto the ground. Those metal shields were like fish scales, glittering with a cold light under the sun. Commandant Su's 5,000 soldiers and Wang Chong's 3,000 covered the mountain from the summit down to the middle. The 8,000 soldiers had been divided into a left wing, right wing, central army, vanguard, and rear wing. These troops had formed several dozen square formations and 10 some echelons, forming layer after layer of dense ranks. These 8,000 soldiers had been squeezed into a very narrow area. This was Wang Chong's adjustment to Commandant Su's strategy. The only thing that could confront the waves of the Tibetan echelon formation were dense ranks of troops to stymie the charge. The rising wind foreshadowed a coming storm. On the summit, the mood was somber and silent. Everyone was tightly gripping their sabers, spears, shields, or axes in their hands, their gazes fixed on that black tide approaching from the base of the mountain. The advantages of the military system passed down by the Great Tang for several hundred years were now being revealed. Even though these soldiers were nervous, even though they were facing down a powerful enemy, not a single one of them cowered. It was the duty of soldiers to follow orders. No matter who their opponent was, once the order was issued, both regular and reserve soldiers would firmly carry it out. Rumble. As the Tibetan horses galloped closer and closer, each one of them with the momentum of 1,000 June, the entire mountain began to tremble. Wang Chong stood on the peak like an unmoving sculpture, his expression completely unmoved. This sort of composure had an invisible effect on the surrounding officers, making them feel much more at ease. 3,000 zhang, 2,000 zhang, 1,000 zhang. The Tibetans were getting faster and faster, continuing to accelerate. Whoosh! A wind suddenly swept over the lands, bringing with it the scent of those who dwelled on the plateau. A scent that all these soldiers were no stranger to. The 60,000 soldiers had fallen under this scent and these scimitars. When they thought about that massacre, everyone gripped their weapons, tension appearing in their eyes. This was an indescribable oppressiveness. Young Master. On the peak, Old Eagle, Commandant Su, and the other officers subconsciously turned to Wang Chong. The blowing wind caused Wang Chong's black hair to scatter, yet that young face seemed as solid as rock. It seemed like nothing would ever be able to move it. The strings of the bows were already pulled, their creaking ringing in everyone's ears. Everyone was waiting for Wang Chong's order. In a battle between armies, archers were always part of the first wave of attack. This was the greatest advantage the Great Tang held over the foreign countries. By occupying the high ground, the Tang army had the luxury of striking first. In those past wars, the Great Tang had relied on its superiority in archery and crossbows to sweep over the cavalry of the other countries. Everyone was waiting for Wang Chong's order. With the battle imminent, even Su Shiping and Old Eagle began to appear anxious. But Wang Chong still did not give the order. Wait some more, Wang Chong calmly said. 800 zhang, 700 zhang, 600 zhang. The Tibetans were getting closer and closer, and were already in the range of the archers. The opportunity would last for only a few moments. But Wang Chong still did not give the order. "My lord." One concerned gaze after another looked toward Wang Chong. The Tibetans far outnumbered the Great Tang. Only by striking first to reduce their numbers could they reduce the pressure exerted by the enemy. Even if it was only a little, it would still be a boon to their circumstances. But Wang Chong did nothing, refusing to give the order. Those bright eyes peered down the mountain with an incomparably profound gaze. No one knew what he was thinking. The stomping of hooves was like peals of thunder, and the ground began to quake even more fiercely. As they watched that approaching flood of steel, the soldiers began to show fear in their eyes. It had not been very long ago that the original army of 60,000 had suffered a disastrous defeat. The image of General Li Zhengyi's death was still seared into their eyes, as if it had only happened yesterday. "Steady!" At 500 zhang, Wang Chong remained silent, but Li Sai took a step forward, his thunderous and energetic voice resounding through the air. 400 zhang, 300 zhang, 200 zhang. Wang Chong still did not issue the order to attack. "Raise shields. Stand ready." These orders were sent down the line. When the Tibetans were only 100 zhang away, Wang Chong's eyes finally flashed. The Tibetans had finally reached the foot of the mountain. Those thousands of horses that had been galloping as fast as lightning seemed to run into an invisible barrier. They slowed, their speed dropping significantly. This small change finally elicited a sigh of relief from Wang Chong. "It's time." Many thoughts flashed through Wang Chong's mind. If one said that the flat plain was the home of cavalry, the mountains were the home of infantry. Only by using the fluctuating geography of the mountains to reduce the speed and flexibility of cavalry would infantry have a chance of contending against large numbers of cavalry. The truly wise person would never fight against cavalry on the plains while being the inferior force. This was why Wang Chong had chosen this mountain to be the place of battle. 70 zhang, 60 zhang, 50 zhang. The Tibetans were getting closer and closer, but as the slope grew steeper, their speed was clearly dropping. The air was growing more solemn and tense. The shaking intensified until it became jolting. At this distance, everyone could make out every hair and vein on the Tibetans, and every Tibetan could see the flaring nostrils and trembling weapons of the Great Tang infantry on the slope. "Kill!" There was an earth-shaking boom as the atmosphere between the two armies seemed to almost solidify. Boom! Lights flashed in the Tibetan army as a massive flame spread beneath Xianxia Dalu's feet to cover his entire army. The halo of fortress, the halo of charge, the yak halo, the speed halo, the halo of black burial, the halo of tenacity. Thousands of halos began to shine, and with the calls of thousands of yaks, multiple halos of thorns enveloped the army. Boom! At almost the same time, the thousands of troops on the slopes above them also began to activate their halos of thorns. Commander after commander unleashed their halos, spreading their effects to the rest of the army. The halo of toughness, the halo of giant strength, the halo of battle, the halo of dexterity, the halo of reaction, the halo of Diju 1. The shining points of light looked like the starry sky. At this point, even Wang Chong had to count himself lucky that he had recruited Su Shiping. This commandant might not have been powerful himself, but none of the officers under him were weak. They all had the halo of thorns expected from soldiers of the regular army, and because of Su Shiping they also had many reactive and defensive halos. Under the light of all these thousands of halos, even the sun seemed rather dim, and time itself seemed to slow to a crawl. It seemed like both an instant and also like countless epochs. Boom! Like a massive wave crashing against a dam, the ranks of the Tibetan army struck the Tang army. In that moment, the earth shook and the sky itself seemed ready to tear apart.